In our reflections, we decided to take up the gauntlet cast by Nina G and rewrite our own icebergs.
However, Wendy still refused to use an iceberg. And then I found I couldn't fit my experience into an iceberg either. So we explored different analogies, broadening our concept of the stammering iceberg analogy.
I found therapy very helpful and insightful. I'm not saying it wasn't, but something was still missing, and university life helped me to further build on the greater knowledge of stammering and explore on a broader level some social issues within the wider society, which answered some questions for me which were still hovering around. I realise now that my artwork, although now I don't see it as artwork, I see it as exploration work, was something that I needed to do. It was my evolving iceberg, externalising stuff as I journeyed through therapy and university. When collaborating with Christine after therapy, we discussed about developing and sharing our own icebergs, but the notion of the iceberg still didn't connect with me. I suppose I wanted to work on my own concept of my own personal iceberg. I feel that stammering sits within society which has beliefs, expectations, cultures and language, and all of which influence thinking and behaviour, and often promote a striving for similarity. But there can be misunderstandings within these beliefs of expectations, cultures and language. A willingness to feel vulnerable can be seen as weak in society, but I now see it as an act of bravery. I also explored the notion of perfectionism in workshops and grew in my awareness that perfectionism and seeking fluency is not all it's cracked up to be. So I collected some of these experiences from my therapy journey and my university journeys and placed them into a societal iceberg. A house emerged, then a row. There was underpinned by their rocky foundations and with smoke-filled chimneys. So a lifeless street began to fill with people going about their daily lives, chatting and playing. So my stammering is now seen in the context of a street with houses and people interacting. There were buried feelings, unknown and unexplored, so it was a hidden ball of stuff. Experiences from within society didn't encourage me to be open about my stammer, but foundations or the underpinnings have been excavated and explored, not just in relation to myself, but in the context of my history, circumstances and wider society. Through the process of bringing stuff into the open, I found ways to be myself and found ways to further understand others. So my shed has grown into a house. So the street provides a way to visualise myself as part of a society and its foundations and attitudes. Growing understandings of all these allows more connections with other people and their houses. There is something very real, raw and mundane, yet beautiful, which comes from this struggle, this excavation and this wider vision. The emerging and continually growing understandings enables me to fit in, to join in and be part of the fabric of society.
Reflecting on the Stammering Iceberg with Wendy, I shared some of my own hidden thoughts and feelings about stammering and stammering therapy. And in a way, there seems to be some parallel between her experience and mine. I too have experienced a changing relationship with stammering. I can reflect on an increased openness, and this has occurred over time and within an evolving context. I recognise that when I began to work with people who stammer over 16 years ago, there were constraints which influenced my thoughts and feelings about stammering and stammering therapy. Personally, I was relatively inexperienced working with this client group. So initially, a prescribed framework for therapy gave me a sense of security. I had a level of personal perfectionism and uncertainty, and this provoked some anxiety, and actually I was tempted to accept the status quo or even abandon working with people who stammer. At this time there was an emphasis on evidence-based practice. This brought challenges from managers about the efficacy for therapy with people who stammer. And actually stammering didn't compete that well for resources within an acute therapy setting in an adult service. Nor did it fit their typical care pathways. So as a speech and language therapist working with a very, very small caseload of people who stammer, I was often a lone voice, and that gave quite a sense of isolation. I gradually began to recognise that the constraints that I was feeling were actually coming from the context within which I was working. There were expectations of very defined episodes of care and an emphasis on face-to-face contacts and defined outcome measures. And I felt that this tended to focus therapy onto the individual with expectations of change in communication or even in fluency. And I became less and less comfortable with this situation. So I too took courage to look within the water around stammering. I actually found support in the community of specialist speech and language therapists, and that was within the local and the national clinical excellence networks. I invested in training, specialist supervision, and enjoyed the dynamic debates developing around stammering. And I began to rely more on practice-based evidence, a person-centred narrative therapy with acceptance and commitment therapy and solution-focused brief therapy, all contributing to a broadening basis for my approach. I also took courage to listen to and connect with the wider stammering community. I became increasingly willing to speak up with and for people who stammer. as the narratives and language began to change and the seeds of stammering pride were germinating. I found that not everything in the water around stammering was cold and harsh, and from this growing sense of belonging, I could allow myself to become more vulnerable. And so I gained in flexibility, in curiosity, and started to be more inventive, focusing on community as well as individuals. And actually, this engagement with stammering became increasingly much more enjoyable and full of variety. And so, having reflected on all that, and thinking about the iceberg, I found that my experiences were visualised more comfortably by something different. Not an iceberg, but the outline of a tree. Through this visualisation process, I realised that my early anxieties, my sense of isolation, and the imposed restrictions around stammering therapy, though potentially negative, actually had formed part of the stimulation which contributed to my developing freedom as a therapist and my ability to partner with people who stammer. This idea of analogy of a tree seemed to sit really well with me when thinking about stammering. It reflected a new narrative, and in that, difficulties were actually a stimulus for seeking a better story. So hidden things, once revealed and understood, can have great beauty. Anxiety can be the seed of courage. Restriction can stimulate creativity. Isolation can reach out to others. A variety of nutrients feeds a tree, and often a battered and bruised trunk gives way to fresh green leaves which flourish, constantly change, and are replaced as growth continues. The other thing that I think is amazing about this analogy is that trees provide shelter under which saplings grow and mature. And to me this reflects a community of people who stammer, increasingly sharing their stories and insights, but with therapists and allies listening to, partnering with people who stammer, sharing experiences and dilemma with clarity, humility, care and compassion, and this is just wonderful to see. So, let's embrace exciting open reflection, explore together and continue to grow.